maybe a minute towards afternoon, but nonetheless, welcome to the Wits School of Governance webinar on corruption. And if you give us gifts, we'll make it short and sweet. We're going to have a wide-ranging discussion on issues around corruption, and we've got distinguished panelists who are joining us. And I want to thank them on behalf of the Wits School of Governance for everyone taking time out to join the webinar. Much appreciated. So I'm one of the panelists. My name is Ivor Sarakinsky. I'm a professor at the Wits School of Governance, and I'll be talking a bit later on. And all the distinguished panelists will introduce themselves as we proceed. As we go through the discussion, please use the Q&A function to send questions through. And then when the presentations are done, we'll have a response to the questions that are presented. So off we go, and let me hand over to our chairperson for this afternoon's discussion, Professor Mavuso Soko from my sister school, the Wits Business School, and he'll be steering us through for the next hour and a half, 2 hours. So over to you, Prof, and I look forward to chatting to you all a bit later.
Prof. Mose, can you please unmute?
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Sarakinsky, for giving me this opportunity to chair this afternoon's webinar on corruption and ethics in public life. I look forward to the conversation. We have assembled a very formidable team of panelists here who are highly knowledgeable about issues of corruption and malfeasance and mismanagement, not only in the public sector, I may say, but also in the private sector and other sectors in society. So they will be able to share with us insights that they've gained over the years through their experience of analyzing and researching issues related to corruption. So we have 4 panelists here. First panelist is Mr. Mavuso Msimang, who's a very well-known public figure in South Africa, who has a tremendous international experience, who's worked not only in South Africa, but also overseas for many, many years. He was in exile for 30 years, and he was associated during those years with international development agencies like the World Service of Canada and Care Canada. And when he came back to South Africa, he's held many senior positions, including in government as Director General of the Department of Home Affairs. He's a very experienced civil servant, and currently he's a chairman of Corruption Watch. He also holds other positions as a trustee of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, deputy chair of African Parks Network, and trustee of the Peace Parks Foundation, as well as chairman of the Appeals Board, South African Military Veterans. Welcome, Mr. Msimang, and thank you very much for making yourself available for this conversation. And we also have another panelist, Mildred Nkopane, who's currently employed by the Gauteng Office of the Premier as the Chief Director, Integrity Management, and is also responsible for the Gauteng City Region Ethics and Anti-Corruption Program. Previously, she worked as an employee, the head of Department Risk Management in the Ekurhuleni Metropolitan Municipality. She's currently responsible for the following directorates in the Office of the Premier: Ethics and Anti-Corruption, Values-Based Management, and Batupili Compliance, as well as Security Management. And our third panelist is Professor Ivor Sarakinsky, who's a professor at the Wits School of Governance. He has already introduced himself. He specializes in governance as well as the green economy. He's a regular media political analyst on governance and politics in South Africa. And our final panelist is Kavisha Pillay, who's currently employed as the head of stakeholder relations and campaigns at Corruption Watch. She's a journalist by training, having studied journalism at the University of Johannesburg, and she's prepared a presentation on the work that Corruption Watch has been doing, and we look forward to listening to that. She'll be our final speaker. So the order of speakers will give them 10 to 15 minutes. It will be Mr. Mavuso Msimang, who will do a presentation, followed by Mildred Nkopane, followed by Ivor Sarakinsky, and we will conclude with Kavisha. And some of the themes that the panelists will touch on is a very wide-ranging themes that they will look at in this webinar. They'll look at such themes as the structural collapse of public functions, potential challenges to the rule of law, breaches of the social contract, increased social distress, the weakening of institutions of substantive democracy, deepening social divisions and increased levels of disorder. They'll also look at on the features of our governance frameworks that appear responsible for failures in public leadership. So it's a very wide-ranging set of issues that they'll be dealing with. I will start then, without wasting time, with invite Mr. Mavuso to do his presentation, and that will be followed in the order that I described. And then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. Use the Q&A function to ask questions or to raise comments, and I will relay those to the panelists. Mr. Mavuso Msimang, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Soko. I was given the assignment of looking at, well, you've got the broad topic of corruption and ethics in public life. And I thought the best place to go to would be the, well, I was given two topics: features of governance, as well as, let me just monitor this. I want to bring this at the top. So. Yes, thank you. Frameworks responsible for failure in public leadership. And another subtopic is deepening social divisions and increased levels of social disorder. What's that now? I consulted the Constitution of South Africa, Chapter 10, which deals with public administration. Paragraph 196 specifically talks about the Public Service Commission. That's an institution that's been very much neutered in government, and I'll have something to say about that. I went to Chapter 5 as well to look at presidential powers, the President of South Africa, and the National Development Plan, which is really the official document for the government adopted. And so it's not one of the greatest development plans that I've come across, but Chapter 13 is good enough. It talks about building a capable and developmental state. So going to the Public Service Commission, which is covered in Chapter 10, the Commission is an independent, supposed to be. It's independent, must be impartial, and must exercise its powers and perform its functions without fear, favor, or prejudice. I've brought the slide up because of the requirement that they exercise their functions without fear, favor, or prejudice. no person or organ of state may interfere with the function of the commission. If we just get into the discussion right there, at the 1994, a new set of ministers appointed under the democratic dispensation that we have now came into government, and they were not comfortable quite correctly with the existing Public Service Commission the provisions. They wanted a more developmental, transformative public service commission, which I think was good as far as it went. So they had to change the apartheid one and bring in the newer one. So that Public Service Commission is accountable to the National Assembly and to the legislature of a particular province. I'm saying here the importance of the Public Service Commission is such that it's not accountable, it's attached to the public DPSA, Department of Public Service and Administration, but it is really accountable to Parliament and to the legislature of whatever province it happens to be dealing with. Now, just to go back to the powers of the Public Service Commission, it is supposed not to be interfered with, but it has been interfered with very, very much. And part of the problem we're having in the public service is that the oversight that it's supposed to provide over the functioning of the civil service has been really neutered by the active involvement of the ministers, the executive authority, as it is called. It started out, it had a president when it started. Now it has a chairperson. Maybe that doesn't matter very much, the Public Service Commission, but the appointment of senior civil servants, DGs, Deputy Directors General, has been taken over by the ministers, and there is hardly any meaningful role that the Public Service Commission performs in this regard. So there is an area immediately of a serious collapse, really, or undermining of a function, and the consequences have been quite evident. Let's just deal with presidential powers. I'll come back to this later. The president, of course, appoints cabinet ministers, the justices of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice and the justices there of Concord, National Director of Public Prosecutions, National Commissioner of Police, etc., etc. I'm pointing these as the powers of the president. With the passage of time, it became very clear that while not much can be done about the president's appointment of ministers and cabinet ministers, this responsibility ought to be controlled. You can't just get somebody, say, from the Free State because you like them and decide to make them a minister of, say, minerals, when perhaps they don't fit the bill. In other words, it is going to be very important that the president carries out these functions in full consultation with, say, with the cabinet or members of cabinet. This is essential to avoid the kinds of things that we are seeing today. Ultimately, don't get me wrong, the president must have the prerogative to appoint his cabinet, but there must be a demonstration of consultation, informed consultation on these matters. The Constitutional Court, we were very happy to have Constitutional Chief Justice Mogoeng, with due respect to everybody, the candidate that most people thought would be suitable for the position was Justice Dikgang Moseneke. For whatever reasons, I think if the people had sat down and if the president had consulted, he would have been advised, I think, perhaps to put him as priority, and Nkopane and any other person as people also to consider from. It is very fortunate that Chief Justice Nkopane carried out his responsibilities very faithfully to the Constitution, and so it was a good appointment. It was a good appointment. Point being made is that it should be fully consulted. One would kind of, even in those private consulting rooms, expect the president to explain why he didn't choose one and elected to choose another. National Commissioner of Police, we have had disasters here where people with absolutely no experience in policing being appointed to take up these positions. But also, we've had tainted police commissioners, and with little regard that's been attached to ethics, you get people being appointed to other positions, again, because the president or that particular office has the right, the authority to do that. Chapter 9 institutions, I must say, thanks to a very large extent to private sector, social justice organizations, Corruption Watch among them. The appointment of the last public protector was very much participatory. Whatever happened thereafter, at least there was good consultation, but as a rule, they have no obligation to consult. The point I'm making is that it is essential for people to exercise their powers in consultation. Very quickly, to refer to what's happening in the United States now, I think all of a sudden, I think the Americans are discovering that that emperor has no clothes at all. Trump is going to trampling over the Constitution, over the democracy in the United States, and it seems as if they don't have much power to do anything about that. There's some circuitous things that they can do. But I hope that we will in South Africa be able to curb the power of the president, whichever president, in such a way that there is much more formalized consultation in the exercise of his duties. The National Development Plan, Chapter 13, talks about building a capable developmental state. Again, says that the public service, the PSC, has to be immersed in the development agenda, but it must be insulated from undue political interference. It's a point I touched on. It's really being interfered with. It is being constrained. Lutuli House, the head office of the ANC, has a deployment committee, which actually selects people who must go to government and to the SOEs. And it just does not belong within the Constitution. But it's taking place, it's happening, and the consequences are very evident. Public Service Commission ought to review every appointment, participate perhaps together with the executive authority concerned, the minister concerned, but must oversee the suitability of the people who are being appointed. There should be clear governance structures and stable leadership to enable state-owned enterprises to achieve their developmental potential. We have seen state capture really just completely making a nonsense of this requirement. State capture actually differs from the normal corruption, not because it's easy or less, but there you have a perversion, a corruption of people who who have the authority to carry out the functions that the capturer wants to abuse. So you will have a minister responsible for appointing a board in a state-owned entity, and they will then be corrupted. This is where the capture comes in. Corrupt right from the beginning, the head or the minister, and get the results you desire as the capturer. That's really what distinguishes it from the corruption, however bad. It could be a Bosasa type of corruption, but Bosasa found some corrupt people and were able to bribe them and give them money and got what they got. Here, you are actually undermining the entire institution of governance. The National Development Plan in paragraph 2, this thing calls for the creation of an administrative head of the public service with a responsibility for managing career progression of heads of department. In other words, you would move away, you would encourage a professional, creation of a professional civil service, where people go in there to provide a service over, it's a career people. And the suggestion here, which has not been implemented, and we are, I think, 10 years short of the end of the National Development Plan. There's been no implementation of the creation of, let's say, a super DG, if you will, or a DG in the office of the president, who would, for example, have a role also in the administration of the DGs. A hybrid of that may be considered. Some countries do these things. They do make appointments of people who change with the political organization in power. When the Democrats leave, then some of the top civil servants. But there is a need to look at creating a professional civil service and making sure that they are freed from interference by authorities. So the National Development Plan, the building of a capable and developmental state. I've just discussed this point. Enhancing the Public Service Commission to champion and monitor to ensure that only competent and suitably experienced people are appointed to senior positions. The fact of the matter is that if you really desperately wanted somebody to get a job in government, you need to talk to the minister now. And the likelihood is that because of the power they wield, that person will get in. I speak from personal experience when I say that you had people who were totally in the interview process, found them completely unsuitable, but it was clear that an arrangement had already been made to have the person appointed. Now, there is one thing that still stays in the government regulations. The Public Service Act currently allows for the executive authority, which is the minister, it empowers them to appoint the heads of department and the deputies, which is the DG and the DDG. This is totally untenable, and it has created a lot of problems because not different from what I was discussing a little earlier. You have as a DG, you might wish to appoint somebody based on following the required processes and procedures. But if the minister wants somebody else, you would have to live with that appointment because they've got the final decision. So you can imagine somebody who saw you in the interview room who will be told by the friend minister that this one didn't want you, but I got you in anyway. And you know, with the thing is, it opens up those possibilities, and this has happened in practice. I can tell you of a person who stopped from being employed who, at DDG level, who didn't have a degree, but the minister advocated for their employment. Very fortunate they were able to stop that, but it's a struggle. A process that ought to be straightforward to get the best people has to be fought for, and most of the time, the correct procedures are defeated. The SOEs, public interest mandate for SOEs, there needs to be a coordination between policy and shareholder ministries by making them jointly responsible for the appointment of the board. As you know, at the moment, the board is appointed by the minister responsible for the particular portfolio, really with scarcely any need to consult anybody. So you do again get, we've seen the practice of the totally unsuitable people sitting on boards, say nothing about the subversion, deliberate state capture type of thing of appointing people who ended up totally destroying the institution. My screen here is, sorry, I'm trying to struggle with technology. Yeah. I've exhausted one part of the two areas that I had to deal with, and very quickly, I see I'm running out of time. South Africa, social divisions. I'm just really making points here. That South Africa is a class-based dual economy. Thabo Mbeki has famously said there are two nations here, but they clearly are rich and poor. And race, and before people strangle my throat, race is a factor still, but the key differentiator in South African society is class. I want to also point out that white people in this country do retain advantage which was caused by history, in history, by their class position at the end of apartheid. So absolutely, there is no doubt that there are benefits that derive from having been from association with apartheid, but it was always a class position even there. You now have, a black middle class and elites who are clearly socially distinguishable from the bulk of the black people who form the underclass of unemployment, of poverty, and social exclusion. So the divisions are really class-based. There's no denying the fact that historically people have benefited from the racist policies of the past. But if you want to do a proper analysis of the problem of social divisions and the problems that arise with that, you have to look at issues of poor and rich, which is a class issue. So the use of aggregate data for racial groups, or on the average for racial groups, obscures social stratification within racial groups and the extent to which race has ceased to be the key causal factor for inequality. I've done some good reading. I would refer people to the paper written by Professor Jeremy Sikking, who is with the Center for Social Science Research. The importance to me of this is that we are using apartheid type of markers to deal with current problems. One understands that historically the African people were right at the bottom of the rung, and so on. The ladder went to be topped by white people. But if we want to go forward, we do really need to use under other indicators, the real indicators, in order to be able to come up with the solutions that deal with class problems. Sometimes one gets the impression that people are sticking to the old thing just so that they avoid, since some of us are now in the higher classes, in the upper classes, and government, of course, by and large, is constituted by people who are a social class that's very different from the people who are at the bottom. So the classification, the general statement into categories, it occurs in all societies, and this is what Maud describes as social divisions. And that may include other types of differences like class, gender, sex, and ethnicity. And there comes the explosion. I think other colleagues will discuss on this thing. So also we need to understand that social divisions are created rather than being natural. We create these things. We see skin color, eye color with some of the people if you can't find any differentiator. And so when dealing with issues of class divisions, we must bear in mind that these things are not inborn. I thank you, and I'll be happy to discuss, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mavuso, for setting the tone with this discussion. I will now invite Mildred to go ahead and do her presentation. Is Mildred there?
Good afternoon.
Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to the members of the panel and those who are part of this discussion this afternoon. I'm just going to share my presentation. Are you able to?
Mildred, we are struggling to hear you a bit, so is it possible to go closer to the speaker?
Can you hear me now?
Okay, that's a little better.
Much better.
Much better. Okay. Thank you so much. Good afternoon once again. In terms of the topic that I'll be touching this afternoon, it's on the issue of is the widespread collapse of public function the result of improper conduct by a few red apples, or is it a conduct and outcome of the way in which we have organized our systems of governance and public accountability? And I'll also touch on the structural collapse and functionality of the public function. Okay. So if we look at South Africa, we can say that corruption has become an endemic problem to the country. Normally,
Mildred, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I really am. It's just that some people are really struggling to hear, and it's not coming across as very clear. So can we just get the sound right?
Okay, I've just increased the sound. Am I audible enough now?
Yeah, that's much better for me. I'm hoping that everybody else can hear you.
Okay, I hope that they will be able to hear me now. I'll try to also speak louder. As I indicated that if we look at corruption in South Africa, it has become an endemic problem. Normally would say that it is a cancer to our country. And corruption basically undermines the democracy, and it has got a negative impact on service delivery. What do I mean by saying that it has got a negative impact on service delivery? Corruption doesn't happen in isolation. It happens basically as people are delivering the service to the citizens of this country. Hence, we're saying that it has got an impact on that, because if at all we have to buy goods and services as the public sector, and that price is inflated because of corrupt activities, that will definitely hamper a service delivery per se, because we won't be able to provide a quality service to the citizens. And secondly, we think that corruption has got an impact on socio-economic development as well as job creation, because the funds that government has are supposed to assist in terms of creating an enabling environment for jobs to be created in the country. And again, it has got an impact in terms of the public trust. Because of corruption, the public tends not to trust government in terms of what government says they will be able to do for them. And also it has got an impact in terms of investor confidence, especially if we look at now as a country that we have been downgraded. And some of the factors that we have been downgraded is due to the issues of corruption. So if we look at corruption, basically it manifests in all spheres of government. And one thing that I can say is that it happens in both public and private sector. We've seen in the past years or recently, as well as we go through the Zondo Commission to see what the private sector does as well and the public sector with regard to corruption. So basically, South Africa has got a problem not only in the public space but also in the private sector. Because if we look at corruption, we normally say that it takes two to tango. So there is a corruptor and the corruptee. In response to the question that was asked, I just want to give a quick definition of what accountability is. And I'm referring to what Van Nest et al. And Pillay and Mavuso have actually defined it. And they say that accountability refers to an obligation to explain and justify actions, and therefore demand that actions of public institutions be publicized to encourage transparency and also to encourage debate and criticism. So basically, if you look at the definition of these scholars, basically they're saying that with accountability, we expect those that have been put in position of accountability to do whatever that they do in a transparent manner, and they need to make sure that whatever that they do is made public. Like I'll touch on it later on when I talk about the impact general, and also there should be debate and criticism of what those that have been put in the position of accountability have done. What are the mechanisms that is put in place as the country to ensure that there is public accountability? So with regard to some of these mechanisms that was put in place, I'll start by talking about the governance arrangements. For instance, we've got a parliament and the legislature that are actually responsible to exercise oversight on the executive and the administration. And they do that through what we have as the established governance structure, such as the SOFA, which is the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, as well as the portfolio committees. Like for various departments, there is portfolio committees that they actually account to at Parliament and the Speaker. As well as in local government spheres, we normally have what we call Municipal Public Accounts Committee, that the executive or the mayoral committee is accountable to, as well as what we call the Section 29 committees in terms of the structured text. The other accountability and oversight structures that are there in terms of the constitution is basically the Chapter 9 institutions. I'll start with the public protector. I think Mavuso did touch on the issue of the public protector as well. So we've got the public protector, and the public protector has the power to investigate any conduct in state affairs or in public administration. And basically, as a mechanism of accountability, the public protector has also the power to investigate all allegations of maladministration, fraud, and corruption in all spheres of government. And we also have the Auditor General. As we know that the Auditor General is constituted based on the Constitution, and also what we call the Public Audit Act. And the Auditor General is responsible for overseeing the management of public finances on behalf of Parliament. Their function includes, amongst others, investigating and auditing all accounts and financial statements of all organs of state. Then Mavuso spoke about the Public Service Commission. is another structure that is there to ensure accountability. And we did indicate that it's derived from the Section 195 of the Constitution, and they are responsible for oversight, monitoring, investigating, and evaluating organizations and practices of public service. Then we've got other critical structures that are there for ensuring public accountability, which is like your National Prosecuting Authority, the NPA, which is established in terms of Section 179 of the Constitution, and their authority to ensure criminal proceedings on behalf of the state and to ensure that perpetrators of crime are held responsible for their functions. Then we also have the SIU that also has been it's a structure that is there to, which has got the authority to recover and prevent financial losses to the state caused by elected officials and so forth. Then we have also the judicial institutions that have the power to scrutinize the abuse of administrative powers and make office bearers and public officials to account for their actions. So basically, these are some of the mechanisms that have been put in place for public accountability. Then the issue is that what is the current state of public accountability and the structural collapse? If we look at Parliament, legislature, and the municipal council, as I spoke about earlier on, as the governance arrangement of our country, the members of the cabinet, the executive council at a provincial level, the mayoral committees are actually accountable to these governance structures. However, these governance structures are finding it difficult to hold the executive and administration accountable. And some of the things that are causing this to happen is cited, like from the ethical point of view. If you look at how the people that are in parliament or legislature and municipal council are actually placed, and also those are in executive, you find that in political parties across the board, the challenge is that when they deploy their public officials, those that are senior ranking are always sent to the executive side, which is your cabinet or executive council or the mayoral committee. And those that are not very senior, they are sent to the parliament or legislatures or municipal council. And that creates an ethical dilemma. Why am I saying that? If those seniors have to come and account to their juniors in terms of the political ranking, it sometimes becomes difficult for those that are supposed to review and analyze and question their actions, because one of the key things that left is the issue of loyalty versus the issue of accountability. Loyalty is a positive value, and accountability is also a positive value. So that creates a problem to say that you hold them accountable, or do you become loyal to the party? We've seen that with the report that was presented by the public protector, the previous public protector then to Parliament, that it was difficult, and they had to go through that ethical dilemma to say that this loyalty or the of and sometimes, like for instance, if you look at sometimes it's also difficult to go for loyalty or to become honest with that. But in this regard, I think as an executive is therefore, based on the legislation, these are the assumptions that we are imposing to the executive. Then the other issue is around leadership challenges. I think personal traits are critical in terms of the people that are being deployed to the legislature or parliament, as well as to the executive side. Because if at people don't have positive values and their values are not aligned with is that those people, when they have to make decisions, they won't be thinking about what is the benefit for the people. They might not be thinking about what is the benefit for the generation to come. Because from their side, because their value system is not aligned to the constitution, we'll be thinking more on a self challenge here when we talk about the structural collapse with regard to this one is the issue of the level of independence of the public protector. I spoke about the process and mention of the public protector, and I think it's very important for the public protector to be always independent. The public protector, as much as it's appointed by Parliament, they've got the relationship with the executive. And it's very important that at all times they need to make sure that their independence is not impaired in terms of their relationship with the executive. The other issue with the public protector is about safety organizations. Here I'm going back to the issues of the value. To say that if at all the value system of the people that are in the public protector organization are not aligned to the constitutional values, then we are going to have a problem. As well as the issue of executive leadership influence, as I've touched on it, to say that it depends on who is the executive at that point in time. And it depends on the value system of the individual, whether they can be influenced to do the right thing as the public protector, or they can be influenced to do the wrong thing. Then the other...
I invite you to wrap up.
Okay, I'll just run through quickly. The other one that I want to touch on is basically the special investigation unit, just to indicate that in terms of the special investigation unit, the challenge is that they conduct investigations based on what the president approves, and also their response tends to be approved by the president. So it all depends on the president at that point in time. And then the critical one is the National Prosecution Authority. That we can say that over time we had challenges with the prosecution of corruption and maladministration. So basically there was a collapse with regards to the National Prosecution Authority. With the Auditor General, I think just a quick one to say that Auditor General over the years has been reporting on material irregularities. But whatever that they're reporting to Parliament. But there are no actions that are being taken against the executive with regard to the issues that the Auditor General is reporting on. So those are the indications that there has to be some just to touch on the issue of good and bad apples in organizations. Normally in an organization, based on the Ethics Institute, is that we've got 10% of bad apples, and then we've got about 10% of good apples, and then we've got about 80% of people that are decent, but and these people, they can be influenced by either the bad apples or the good apples. So we are saying that it all depends on who is in leadership to be able to make it better. So just to wrap up from my side, I can say that as much as we can indicate that what is the state of the public accountability, and also the issue of saying that was there a structural collapse. I think the influence of that is about the people. You know, they've got a significant influence on how the state will actually run. You know, we can have the best structures, we can have all the best governance arrangements, but it all depends on the people. And I'll just highlight it just using the iceberg model to say that normally we see the behaviors of people, but the underlying factors is the value system, the standards, their judgments, their beliefs, and so forth that makes them behave in a certain manner. So I'll just quickly go to a conclusion. I won't go through the other aspects because of time. I think from my side, I would say that we need to build a capable and ethical and
I think we are losing you, Mildred. Perhaps we should. Hello, Mildred.
Hello?
I think your line is really, really bad. What I would like to propose that, you come back to those issues during Q&A, and while we are sorting out your line, we move on to the next speaker. Is that okay? All right. Okay. So we will move on to Professor Sarakinsky. Over to you.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for chairing the session as well. I would like Mildred to take down her screen, sharing screen, so that the audience can see me. So I'm going to talk about a couple of themes in the corruption debates. And I want to start off with a situation that I'm sure we're all familiar with. We get stopped at a roadblock and a traffic policeman or two traffic policemen walk around your car, repeatedly kicking your tires. Now, anyone who knows anything about motor mechanics and tires knows that kicking tires has absolutely no bearing on the roadworthiness of your car. Kicking tires doesn't even tell you whether the tires have the legal tread limit that's set out in law. So the question then is, at roadblocks, why do traffic officers walk around your car a number of times, kicking your tires before they engage you on the reason for the roadblock? And many of us, I'm sure, have experienced this. So why do they do that? And that gets to the heart of what I think the corruption issue is about. So let's start off and get into this at a little bit of depth and detail. Officials, appointed and elected officials, control processes. They make decisions. They also control the deployment of resources. And that control gives them incredible power. And they can use that power for good or bad. They can use that power to serve the people in terms of their public vocation, or they can use that power to serve themselves and others in terms of rent seeking. So the core issue here in terms of the corruption debate is the power that officials have. And many of you will know that the famous German theorist of bureaucracy, Max Weber, speaks about officials controlling the means of administration. And it's that control that gives them power. So you can rent seek, you can extort favors from citizens who should be serviced as a matter of course. And that enables corruption because you control licenses, you control the issuing of ID books, you control building permits. All of these things are really valuable products, commodities that people need. The other side of the coin is that because people control these resources, outside actors can target them. And this is where the extortion side of the issue comes in. You set up relationships in such a way that the officials who control processes, who want to act honestly, can't because of the threats that they face should they not comply with the demands made by outside actors. So because people control, officials elected and appointed control process and resource means they can abuse it or they can be targeted to abuse it. And that's why traffic officers sometimes walk around your car kicking the tires. It's not about the roadworthiness, it's about a Coke, to use the colloquial expression. And you see this in many departments. Officials are supposed to deliver a service as a matter of course, but you only get that service if you offer a Coke. And that's a euphemism for a bribe. Now, effective governance is all about limiting, not eradicating, limiting the opportunities for that abuse. Officials are insulated so they can do their work in terms of the way bureaucracies function. and bureaucracies are structured and designed in a way to make it very difficult for officials to abuse their office through internal structures, processes, etc. So at a very general level, we can say that effective governance limits opportunities for corruption. It doesn't stop corruption. You need something more, perhaps, if you're going to try and stop corruption. So why then is corruption such a problem? Well, there's collusion between inside actors, elected and appointed officials, and outside actors. They're corruptors and corruptees who collude, and that's a relationship. It's almost a business contract. And in a sense, state capture is that. It's collusion between insiders and outsiders to achieve certain objectives. And we know a lot about that with all the disclosures that have come of late. We don't know a lot about some of the more micro issues at local level, at provincial level. The Auditor General red flags a number of transactions. And if one had to dig deep, one would find that there are degrees of collusion in terms of unauthorized expenditure, fruitless and wasteful expenditure, and irregular expenditure. So it's about relationships inside and outside government. Interesting issue. Johannesburg recently did an internal audit on its PPP procurement, and the amounts are significant, many millions, 50-odd million in 2 weeks spent. And if you look at the companies that got those contracts, some aren't even registered on the central supplier database, which is the bottom line for actually getting a government contract. If you're not on the CSD, you're not even in the ballpark. And many of the companies got those contracts. Other areas, you've got to be BEE compliant to be even in the bidding process. And many companies weren't even able to provide BEE certification in terms of that part of the legislation. Tax compliance is another issue. You're not even in the ballpark if you're not tax compliant, and your quote has to contain all of these documents as proof that you've met the minimum requirements to be even in the game. And if you look at the outcomes of this internal audit in Johannesburg, one sees that there are gross irregularities. Decisions have been made, tenders have been awarded with massive non-compliance. And this happened in the space of 2 weeks. And that tells you that there was collusion. The speed of the deal is a clear indicator of collusion between insiders running the processes and externals benefiting from those processes. So Johannesburg is one case in the COVID-19 environment. There are many, many others. At provincial level, we know a lot about that. And at national level, it's all in the public space. This is how it happens. It's a process of collusion through the control of process. Now, why is this all important? It's massively important in terms of the impact that it does, the impact that it has on our standing as a nation state. As South Africa, the Republic of South Africa, as South Africans, we require some basic framework to regulate our behavior, to guide us, to give us an ethical vision of what our society should be like and how we strive to achieve those objectives. And our Constitution sets out so many of those principles, and it sets out so many of those beacons that we should strive to achieve. What corruption does, it undermines the ability of the Constitution to enable social cohesion at one level, and it also undermines the legitimacy of the rules that are supposed to structure our conduct as citizens. So it has a massive corrosive effect on social structure. And we see that in so many, many ways. If I do this and if so-and-so did this, they benefited, they didn't get caught, nothing happened, why shouldn't I do it? And you have a vicious cycle where society unravels in terms of basic cohesion, basic compliance with norms, standards, and values. So it weakens society significantly. At the level of rule of law, it undermines the ability of institutions, public institutions, to function properly. And I've used examples to illustrate this already. If you've got a supply chain management system and you have collusion, you basically undermine the ability of that supply chain management to achieve the social objectives and even constitutional objectives in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, in terms of spending public money. So it undermines the rule of law, it undermines process, it undermines everything that you would want a society to have in place in terms of steering the behavior of individuals in the right direction. And crucially here is the issue of consequence management. Corruption is a major challenge. It's a very difficult case to make in a court of law, a criminal case, because you've got to prove intent. So you need serious forensic investigations. Do we have the capacity to do that? It might partly explain why the NPA is so slow in bringing so many of the cases we all know about to court. You've got to do that hard forensic work to make a winnable case. The other ways of doing it in terms of asset forfeiture and getting people on other technicalities in order to speed up consequences. And without consequence, people will say it's low risk. Doing corruption is high return on investment because your chances of consequence are minimal. The Public Service Commission isn't innocent in all of this. As public servants, you've got to sign a whole range of documents every year. Your declarations. And if one looks at the numbers for provincial and national government, because the Public Service Commission only applies to national and provincial, local government is not part of its ambit, you see compliance rates that are really low. At one point, it was around 50% for directors up to Director General, just signing and depositing the basic documents. Currently, it's in the 60% range, which is still remarkably low in terms of what you would expect. So why aren't there consequences that flow to officials who don't sign these declarations? Nothing happens. Nothing happens. Why do it? When there's a consequence, you claim you didn't know because you didn't read, you didn't sign the document. So there's major gaps there in terms of the management of these processes. Another side of the coin is the Public Service Commission can participate in disciplinary hearings or provide support to departments that convene disciplinary hearings. And a disciplinary hearing has a much lower threshold of evidence. All you've got to prove is basic wrongdoing in terms of the PFMA or the MFMA or the Public Service Act or any other legislation. And you can discipline the person through an internal hearing, which could even include dismissal. Why aren't we doing enough of that? And if you look at the numbers in the Public Service Commission's annual reports, you'll see that they're remarkably low. And that's a quick, effective way to deliver consequence. We always say, let's wait for the outcome of the criminal case. That's a 5-10 year process. That's venture capital to people who do corruption. There might be a consequence, but in the meantime, I'll take what I can get. So corruption undermines rule of law. It undermines public faith, public trust in institutions, because people know what's going on. Nothing happens. And then people start to say, but I'm not going to play by these rules anymore. And that's part of the dissolving of the social contract, which is supposed to bind the country together. People become lawless. You end up with informal violence, vigilantes who fill the vacuum that public authorities are supposed to fill in terms of ensuring consequence and protecting and being custodians of the basic rules that are supposed to govern society. So it undermines the ability of government public institutions to perform, and numerous examples of this. A recent case in the Free State that's come out in the Zondo Commission, 28 million rand for a basic brick structure of a one-room house. 28 million. You can buy mansions in the Atlantic seaboard in Cape Town for that money. And that tells you a lot about the effects that corruption has at that level too. Corruption also weakens democracy. So if democracy is a process where parties campaign, citizens choose, and parties become the government after an election, the expectation is that they deliver on the mandate in terms of the consent that citizens have given government. What corruption does, it short circuits that electoral mandate, because you've got decision making outside of that institutional, transparent, accountable process. And people cut deals behind closed doors in dark, smoke-filled rooms. Resources go in one direction instead of directions that are mandated in terms of policy supported by citizens in elections. And illustrations here, state-owned enterprises. Where does one begin? There's so many cases here. Transnet, PRASA, Eskom, SAA. One can go on just showing the wastage of resource in terms of not complying with basic electoral mandates in terms of using SOEs to provide developmental infrastructure. The money just disappears into Dubai, into Swiss bank accounts, and citizens are end up with inadequate infrastructure, and it fuels a cycle of public distrust in terms of public institutions and public life. So we know all of these things and we can illustrate them with numerous examples, countless examples, unfortunately, and that's possibly the tragedy of South Africa over the last 15 or so years is exactly that, the lost opportunities in terms of scarce resources being squandered. It doesn't come back easily, it doesn't come back quickly. But the final point that I wish to quickly talk about is the socioeconomic impact that corruption has on society, social distress. You'll often see in the media, in even some of the academic writing, a view that corruption is a victimless crime. Yes, it's bad, but no one really gets harmed. People make a lot of money. They're able in its hurt. And it is a view that many people who do corruption use to justify the acts that they have engaged in. No real victims, no one got hurt, it's okay. Well, there are numerous studies on this, and the studies are very conclusive. And they show conclusively that corruption is certainly not a victimless crime. There are major victims in the context of corruption. How do they demonstrate this? How do the studies basically work? They plot on the y-axis levels of corruption using a range of indicators, and the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index is one of them. And my colleagues here from Corruption Watch know all about that because they manage that survey. So that gives you a sense. There are problems with it, but it gives you a sense of the extent of corruption in society. On the x-axis, you plot GDP. And if you do this across countries, you start to see some trends. Countries with high levels of corruption have lower GDPs. And that's excluding the resource-rich countries. So high levels of corruption, lower economic growth. Who is affected most by lower economic growth? Not the rich, the unemployed who would want employment opportunities. Those who want to better themselves by working hard, get promotions, achieve more. They're affected by this because the country's not growing in terms of the leakage and the wastage. The inverse also applies. Countries with low levels of corruption tend to have very high GDP levels. So we know the socioeconomics of corruption. We can demonstrate that very, very easily. And in the last 10, 15 years in South Africa, our growth rates have been a cause of major concern in terms of the shrinking GDP year on year. And I would argue that there's a meaningful correlation, not a cause, a meaningful correlation there between what we now know about corruption and state capture in the past. We can also plot levels of corruption against socioeconomic development using the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index. And you see exactly the same things. High level of corruption, limited life opportunities. Low levels of corruption, high life opportunities. So we know that corruption makes many citizens worse off. It spectacularly hammers the poor harder than any other socioeconomic group in society. The poor bear the brunt of it. You look at South Africa's hospitals, you look at the housing, the examples I've just mentioned. There are a whole range of examples that demonstrate this conclusively. So how do you deal with this? Rule of law, consequence management. There has to be some kind of negative impact for the people who do this. And it can be the long-term criminal one or the short-term investigation, asset seizure, internal disciplinary hearing. There's a whole repertoire of things that can be done to deliver that consequence. Unfortunately, in South Africa, and I'll conclude in a moment, is that we go for an integrity management approach to dealing with corruption. We have protocols, we have pledges, we have a whole range of let's sit down and hold hands and sing songs about anti-corruption and good ethics, in the belief that we can change the values inside people's heads. And you can't change that easily, if at all. So we go for integrity management, declarations, formal processes in terms of supply chain management, and you end up with a tick box approach to dealing with this difficult problem of corruption. Malicious compliance is what happens when you have integrity management. Integrity management might work best in China. And the reason for that is quick tribunal. If it's a serious case, firing squad. In addition to firing squad or dismissal from your post, all social benefits are removed from your family. So you send out in a rather brutal way, and in a constitutional democracy, you can't do that. But the point here is that you send out a message that not only will your life become worse off, but your dependents will become worse off should you engage in corruption. And that's maybe the way to deal with this. Integrity management with bite, as opposed to integrity management with ritual of malicious compliance and the belief that we can suddenly make good people bad by having workshops on ethics and ethical leadership. Doesn't really work. You need something much harder and much sharper to get the change that is needed. So let me stop there, and we can go into more detail in terms of the parameter, the control of resources that is the precondition for corruption, and the way to deal with it is through effective governance in terms of process, but also consequence management. And ethics and ethical leadership, in a way, are nice to haves, but their effectiveness is not that well known. So I hope that we can pursue this in question time shortly. Thank you, Chair, and thanks, audience, for listening to me, and thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarakinsky. What I'll do next, I'll ask Kavisha to give her presentation, and then I will ask each panelist a question, and then open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Over to you, Kavisha.
Thanks so much, Prof. What I'm going to do is I'm just wanting to, apologies, oh, there you go. Good afternoon, colleagues. Sorry for that. I'm going to switch off my video for the duration of my presentation, but we'll put it back on during the question and answering session, just because I'm having a bit of a bad Wi-Fi day. So I do apologize for that, but let's get started. So about 2 years ago, I traveled to Denmark for a conference in Copenhagen. And whilst I was there, I was completely shocked when I had to use the train to travel in and around the city, because it worked in what is known as an honesty system. And like a few other countries who've adopted this honesty system, basically commuters can purchase a ticket and board either a bus or a train without showing the driver the ticket or scanning it at the turnstile. And this was really perplexing for me as somebody who grew up in Lenasia in Johannesburg. If you didn't have enough money to pay for something, say at a spaza shop, you'd literally have to leave all of your valuables and perhaps parts of your soul whilst you went and sort of scavenged for the rest of that cash. But anyways, I would stand in the station and I would watch and observe commuters who patiently stood in line and purchased their tickets. And I was really stunned at the levels of trust that existed between the Danish government and its people. And essentially the social contract that exists between, the two parties is that the commuters understood that it is in their best interest to purchase a ticket because they depend on a well-functioning public transport system. And this seems really obvious, but still, coming from where we do, it's something that didn't seem natural, and it was very perplexing. And similarly, there are bicycles in and around the city where that have no chains on it, and you don't have to pay any cash. And you can, and the reason why the Danish government does this is, one, to promote health, the health of their people, as well as to ensure that, they reduce their carbon emissions. So with all of this in mind, and what Ivor was speaking about earlier on, it's not surprising that Denmark is often ranked #1 in the Transparency International's annual corruption perception index, because it's the country that's perceived to be the least corrupt. And they have an interesting social contract between the government and the public. And whilst there might be a few people who sort of try and cheat the system and trying to get around it, the majority of people have bought into it because there is an understanding that, I have to purchase this ticket because in the long term, it's going to benefit me. Now, it would be completely unreasonable to compare Denmark with South Africa for a whole range of reasons. But I always thought, since that experience, about, would we ever in our country, is it possible to introduce an honesty system in South Africa? And what needs to happen for us to get to this point? I'm not sure about what the answers are to that question, but I do think it's a start of an interesting debate where we do talk a bit more seriously about ethics and honesty within South Africa. So moving on to 2020, which has also been a really interesting year as a country, and COVID-19, to put it a bit crudely, has been a fascinating social experiment for us. And when coronavirus was declared as a global pandemic earlier this year, many of us were and probably still are committed to the notion that our individual sacrifices will contribute towards a broader global good. And during this time, we have seen, tremendous acts of goodwill and kindness and giving across our society that has the ability to restore our faith in our humanity and in our democracy. But it's also been a time where our weaknesses as a society have been amplified. And the pandemic has exposed our already festering wounds, such as poverty and inequality and unemployment, gender-based violence, our broken health and education systems, the lack of accountability, and perhaps the reason why we're all here today in this webinar is corruption. A recent report produced by Corruption Watch, and it was released a week ago, reveals that corruption is actually on the increase in South Africa. And this is perhaps not surprising. So since 2018, we've seen a decline in whistleblower reports that we were receiving. However, the data that we've received for the first half of this year paints a worrisome picture, and we're currently estimating to receive over 4,000 complaints for this year. The majority of these allegations refer to what is unfittingly termed as petty corruption, because they involve smaller amounts of monies and not necessarily the result of well-established criminal networks such as the arms deal or the state capture project. But nevertheless, these cases tell important stories of the lives of ordinary people who have little choice but to engage in corruption to sometimes access basic services. As this sort of slide shows, is that in Gauteng, we've received the majority of our reports during this time, with 44% emanating from the province. KZN is coming in second place at 13%, and the Western Cape at 10%. And what's important to note is that the majority of cases that we received for the first half of this year, we received them once the lockdown was instituted. So the lockdown has had an effect, and is essentially presented opportunities for people to exploit what is already a very vulnerable time for all of us. And what whistleblowers have told us is that during the lockdown, those in power have abused their position and exploited the state that we're in. The most worrisome trends that emerged were corruption at the hands of the South African Police Service, as well as corruption at a local government level. And it's worthwhile to note that these trends reflect the findings of the 2018 Afrobarometer survey, as well as a recent survey conducted by Corruption Watch around the Youth Perception Survey, where respondents in both these surveys have identified the police and local government as the most corrupt institutions in South Africa. And just by looking at these sort of trending areas, or the sort of hotspots where we've received the most complaints during this time, this also goes to Ivor's point about corruption is not just this economic and victimless crime. Here you can see that it actually has a direct bearing on some of our constitutional rights to healthcare, to education, access to services, access to safety. So our reports, don't necessarily tell us about the big scandals and the PPE scandals that involve billions, but they do tell us how ordinary people in South Africa constantly have to engage in corrupt practices, or do experience corruption, just in trying to get, access to healthcare or education or even policing services. In relation to police, the complaints that we received often involved officers who were, especially during the lockdown, involved officers who were confiscating alcohol and cigarettes from taverns and shop owners, and thereafter selling it back to the community. Or in some instances where the police didn't confiscate the goods, they were accepting bribes from these shop owners and then allowing them to sell these goods despite the lockdown regulations. We were also told about officers who were exercising brute force for misdemeanor violations of the lockdown, and there was a number of these cases that were reported on in the media. And lastly, those who were arrested for serious lockdown violations or other crimes were actually paying police officers so that their dockets got stolen or went missing. So it's a really worrying problem that we're seeing with our police. And what becomes problematic is where the police and other law enforcement agencies are essentially they're entitled to they're basically set up to fight crime and corruption in our country. And when these institutions are themselves corrupt and have serious criminal elements, we have no chance in fighting corruption in other areas of our society. So policing and law enforcement is definitely a huge issue. Another sort of trending area where we constantly receive reports from is local government. And what was seriously concerning for us during this time was the allegations that we received about the theft of food parcels during the lockdown. And this theft of food, exposes corruption in its most basic form. So it's essentially the greediness of those in power who literally steal food out of the mouths of the most vulnerable in our society. And since the lockdown, we've received, between January to June, we received about 67 of these reports, and these reports have been increasing. But what whistleblowers have been telling us is that they've been asked to pay money or to exchange favors in order to receive a food parcel or a food voucher. that food parcels were being distributed using systems of patronage. So reporters have indicated that only friends and supporters and family members of ward councillors were receiving food parcels. And that lastly, some ward councillors or elected officials were stealing the contents of the food parcels and then reselling it back to the communities. On a side note, it wasn't only ward councillors that were implicated in this. We received a few reports about religious groups denying food to people if they were not part of their congregation. And that's how you know we've reached a new low in our society, when even God's people are behaving this way. And then lastly, we received allegations about corruption in our education and healthcare sectors, and employment and procurement corruption are rife within these domains, according to our whistleblowers. And during this time, we've seen a number of issues relating to the procurement of PPE, as well as the building of new infrastructure at schools or at clinics. Now, Jacob Svensson, who is a professor of economics, argues that corruption is a reflection of our country's legal, economic, cultural, and political institutions. He says that it's a response to either beneficial or harmful rules. And this is true, and some of my fellow panelists have touched on this, is that some of our rules in our country do open up opportunities for some to benefit through corruption, whilst other rules force other members of our society to engage in corruption, especially our more vulnerable communities who are trying to access basic goods and services. I've been with Corruption Watch for about 8 years, and I often think about what will be the tipping point for us as a nation. You know, will there be this big scandal that would cause mass outrage and force the public to mobilize and demand the necessary changes? And to be honest, I don't know if that's going to happen. And perhaps this might just be my own cynical view, but I don't think it will happen because corruption has become a de facto part of our social contract. It's becoming so entrenched in our culture and part of our national identity. And I don't say this lightly. This is based on experiences of traveling across the country and engaging with communities and understanding how they've been experiencing corruption, as well as how they respond to it. And what's happening now, and the narrative of corruption, is not just a battle of the greedy versus the moral. There's an entire middle ground of people who lack access and opportunities, who are being persuaded to accept a corrupt system because there's no alternative. And Mildred touched on this earlier about having the 10% who are good apples and the 10% who are bad apples and the 80% who are decent but dubious. And that 80%, you know, is more and more being swayed to accept this corrupt system that we're in. And we're at a point in our country where, whilst the public can be massively outraged by acts of corruption, for example, at Eskom, many would still go to and bribe an official at a local municipality to squash the electricity bill. And this brings us back to the point of ethics and individual ethics. To ensure that corrupt practices don't happen in the first place requires more than just rules and regulations, and Ivor and I might disagree slightly on that. You know, it requires the conscious decision on the part of the players to not engage in corruption. And a few years ago, Corruption Watch mounted an interesting public mobilization campaign called My Hands Are Clean. And the premise of this campaign was that you can't point fingers at those in power whilst you're still engaging in underhand behavior. The fight against corruption has to start at an individual level, and it has to be an individual commitment to not participate and engage in those practices, even if the opportunity is presented. So just to conclude, I have to ashamedly admit that whilst I was in Denmark, I often wondered what would happen if I didn't buy a ticket. What would happen if I cheated the system? And I have no social contract with the Danish government, and in fact, it could be seen as a form of reparations. But what influenced my decision to keep buying tickets was a legitimate fear, one, of being caught out during a spot check. So that does speak to Ivor's point that we do need to be holding people accountable, and there has to be consequences, because I think that does instill a fear that you don't want to be caught and face those consequences. But also, cheating the system puts ordinary people at a disadvantage. And I think in South Africa, we have a long journey ahead, excuse me, in terms of creating a system that adequately punishes those who engage in corruption, as well as ensuring that corruption does not become a become sustainable and part of our culture, we have to go back to that I don't know if we were there, but we have to create the society where we are considerate of what happens to the other. It's not just about me. And lastly, we need to find innovative ways and solutions to get our train back onto ethical tracks. So thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Kavisha. So what I'll do now, colleagues, I will ask each panelist a question. In some cases, a two-pronged question, starting with Mr. Mavuso. A very, very interesting, informative, and sobering presentations that have been made. You spoke at length about the Constitution, presidential powers, the National Development Plan, and how these have, as important mechanisms for undergirding our democratic order, and have in some cases been eroded. I was just interested, based on your experience and your knowledge of the governing party in particular, states, National Development Plan and Capable States. It's a very detailed chapter there in that report, and there's a great deal of talk in this country amongst the leadership about the importance of a developmental state, capable state. I've been hearing this since 1994, but we have not seen any meaningful results in terms of creating an ethical and professional public service. And you spoke about, some problems related to the deployment policy of the governing party and how that has eroded the public service. In your view, how can this problem be resolved? Because there are some who would say a governing party anywhere in the world has the prerogative to appoint people who share its goals, its values, its political outlook. But how do you strike a balance between a deployment policy that is pursued by a political party, as well as the need to create a professional and ethical service, based on your experience? The other issue I wanted to ask you about is the issue around the PPE scandal, and which Kavisha also spoke about. The president had to write that strongly worded letter to all members of the ANC, and even go to the extent of saying, we are accused, number one, in terms of corruption, and those who are either implicated in corruption or face allegations of corruption must step aside. Do you think this is the best way to deal with corruption? If you could just comment on that. And Mildred, your presentation, I was very interested in the towards the end. You couldn't elaborate on that, and I'd like you to do so. You spoke about creating an ethical culture. How does one inculcate and create and embed an ethical culture in public institutions? Perhaps you could use your experience in the Gauteng government to explain to us how you go about doing that. And Ivor, I was very I do agree with you on the issue of corruption, and that it undermines the rule of law, and that it's a major challenge because it's not easy to detect. What I would like to know is, over and above what we're doing as the VETS School of Governance, this is important. We're having a public debate about corruption. We're listening to fantastic analysis of the nature, the depth and scale of corruption. But what more can institutions like VETS School of Governance to do to enable us to deal with corruption? Are we doing enough as institutions of learning and to deal with corruption in this country? What more do we need to do? And Kavisha, I thought that was very interesting, talking about social contract in Denmark, high trust society, and I've also read a lot about how well governed and how the social contract functions there has enabled the country to have this high ethical compass. I'm just interested in the South African context. How do you think we could create a high trust society. You know, your conclusion was very sobering to me because you define our social contract. You say now corruption has become our social contract in South Africa. I sense there is an air of resignation and despondency. Do you think it's impossible for us as a country to create a high trust society? And also, perhaps based on the reports you have compiled as a corruption watch, have you done any work on corruption in the private sector? We know about corruption in the public sector. In local government, you've mentioned it. We know the scale, the reports, the Auditor General publishes reports, and so we know. But how much are we doing as institutions like yours, to shine the light on the private sector? We know about KPMG, Steinhoff, but is there any systemic research that is being done to enable us to understand the scale and depth of corruption in the private sector? So those are the questions I'm asking the panelists, and then we'll open for to the audience if the audience, members of the audience have questions and comments, and we'll invite those. So let me start with you, Mr. Mavuso.
Well, thank you very much. You ask about why there has been no change when for so long people have been talking about the necessity to build a capable, a transformative state. I think we really need to face, I think there's a number of reasons for this. One is, in the difficult struggle days, joining the ANC was not one of the favorite things for people to do. It entailed a lot of risk. And so people really with their commitment, devotion, were willing to even lay down their lives, would join the organization. When freedom came and the ANC won, and they really won because they did play a very important role in bringing about liberation in this country. They, together with others, but certainly the ANC did play an important role. That made them very attractive to the people. They were of the people really to a very large extent. And a lot of the time people talk about Mandela, Sisulu. Those, of course, are really good examples of people with integrity and so on. But so also were very many people from society, unnamed heroes and heroines, if you will. So the organization had that reputation. But come 1994, an association with the ANC immediately brought about the potential for benefit at a personal level, economic benefit. And there was a call by some of the older people, or some people in the organization, for a change in the recruitment processes and the admittance of people into ANC membership, that it becomes stricter, that you don't allow a person to come in unless they met certain fairly rigid criteria. And the argument, of course, was that you don't necessarily need a quantity, large numbers of people to be in the ANC, but rather quality of good people. After all, 10 million plus people have always voted for the ANC, and it's never had more than 1 million people. So I guess if there was good work being done, credibility, you did not need to focus so much on numbers rather than on quality. This did not happen, I think, in part. So what did happen was that imported into the ANC, right up to leadership level, were people with very little interest in the service of people per se. And so because the ANC was in power, we transferred these people into government. So you come in as a corrupt person or as a person with really no interest in people's concerns, and you take that across to government. That's really one of the major reasons why we're in this dilemma. I think it would be corrected by for the ANC and its own sake, whether one day it ends up in the opposition, to have quality members. And there's a lot of work that you can do in the opposition benches, you know, bonding more strongly with the people. There's something that's called the sins of incumbency as well. People get used to this, and the ANC has been very predominant, even when people erred. The threat of being removed from power is really very remote because of what we're saying about the history of the organization. It's changing a bit. Who would have thought that Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Mandela Bay would be under the opposition or would slip away from the hands of the ANC? Your top shelf people coming from these areas, serving in the liberation struggle and serving the cause of the people. So a short answer to that, you know, no one has got solutions to these complex things, is it's going to be important for the ANC, for its own sake, to have quality people who are committed to the cause of the people, people of integrity and so on. We lack integrity now. I mean, if at the highest level of the organization, you hear somebody saying, ethics, what are you talking about? Resign or step aside? No, you have not been found guilty by a court of law. For Christ's sake, you know, how can that happen at that level? That just tells you how much of a problem we are in if somebody at the level of the top officials of the country says no. And so you have a pack of people who have appeared before the Zondo Commission, who are to all intents and purposes, who stand discredited in the eyes of the people, and all you stand on is the tenuous excuse that they have not been found guilty in a court of law. So ethics, morality have really been thrown aboard by and large, and everybody, every one of us seems pretty helpless to do anything about it. I think we do. That is the problem, and it is the major problem. We've got people with very low ethical thresholds, if any ethics at all, who are very influential in senior positions, not only in the ANC, but also in government. So you are not going to start performing properly in government when, in fact, you know, essentially you came into the party for different reasons. I know we could go on forever here, but I think in summary, there is that. In fact, we're a little luckier in South Africa than in many African countries where ruling parties have got the support of 90% and more, 99% of the people. You always had an opposition here, whether from the black group or another group. So that, I hope, the opposition, proper opposition, gets strengthened. If you go unchallenged, you really do become too familiar and too self-confident and too relaxed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mildred?
I hope I'm audible this time around. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Mildred.
Are you?
All right, shall we? Yeah, we go ahead. So the question was, how do we inculcate a culture, an ethical culture within institutions, public institutions, using Gauteng as a case study, as through the lens of your experience?
Thank you so much. I hope that I'm audible and I don't have the problem with the network. In terms of Gauteng, I can indicate that how we started to inculcate the ethical culture. One of the key things that we focused on was the issue of political will. To say that there should be that political will, able to fight corruption and make sure that it's not. So what do I mean by the political will? One of the key things that we look at in Gauteng is that the moral tone of the organization is established the organization. Like for instance, if the sector and the senior has what the leadership of the province should be doing in terms of making sure that they lead their institutions or departments in an ethical way. For instance, if I can give an example, when the new administration came in, I mean the chief administration came into power in the term of office, one of the critical things that they did is that there was a training that they did with the leaders MEC, where they trained on the issues of ethical leadership, and they had leader stakeholders who were working with him in that regard. And the other issue with regard to political will is that political leadership is committed to make sure that they portray an exemplary way at all times to make sure that the people that are following or the people that are looking upon them are able to make sure they are able to live in an ethical way. And also they must be willing, to be punished where they have demonstrated an ethical behavior. I think with regard to housing in this regard, to say that when there was issues around ethics, the political leadership was willing to say that you need to make decisions where we allow people to go on this so that we can be in a position to deal with this unethical investigation. The other issue that I wanted to raise is that normally we've got instruments that we put in place to deal with unethical behaviors. Like for instance, from our side, we've got governance structures that we've put in place, like the Housing Ethics Advisory Council, which is an independent body that has been established by the Premier, that advises the Premier in terms of how does it deal with the issues of corruption. And then the other aspect, if you check in the city administration, Gauteng never had so many cases of fraud and corruption. The reason being that we implemented what we call an open tender system, which was basically to make sure that we've got transparent process of procurement. And by doing that, we saw numbers of whistleblowing with regards to allegation of corruption reducing. So basically, the open tender system assisted us in terms of making sure that we start to build an ethical institution. And also the other area was that we started to implement what we call consequence management. If you still remember, in the fifth administration, we also did the same, whereby there were some of the accounting officers when we found guilty of fraud and corruption. And it was clear from the Premier perspective to make sure that those people, they go through the process of disciplinary, and we do open up the criminal cases against those officials that, according to the forensic reports, have been found to have done something illegal. Unfortunately, from our side, because I think if we can have people that go to the court, that will strengthen our fight against corruption, and it will improve the ethical culture in government. Unfortunately, the system of our criminal justice system is very slow, and I think that actually hampers us in terms of making sure that we strengthen that. But we're hoping that in future, because one of the things that we've done at Gauteng is that we've started to sign MOUs with these institutions to make sure that they are able to expedite our cases, because we are of the view that if at all our cases can go to the court, then we'll be sending a message to all the officials that they need to act in an ethical manner. So those are some of the things that we are doing as a province to make sure that we institute the culture of ethics. And I hope that from government point of view, if you look at the Public Service Commission, as much as it's looking at the public service, but if you look at other countries have got their Public Service Commission, which are basically an independent body, and they've got chiefs to act. Whilst ours, I think at the moment, they don't have much chiefs to act, and that is where the problem is, because they are a task to make sure that we've got an ethical public service. And if they don't have chiefs and they are compromised in the process, that could create a problem. Then I think we can improve that by having independent.
Thank you very much, Mildred. Over to you, Ivor.
Thanks, Milt. There are two important roles, or at least two important things higher education institutions can do in contributing to combating corruption. The first one entails the following. When we talk about corruption, we're normally looking at one aspect, which is the adjudication of tenders and how the process of adjudicating was calculated to advantage a person. There's another side to that, and that is to look at the specifications committee, the committee that sits before the tenders put out, and they set out the requirements. So clever corruption occurs way back before you even advertise the tender in terms of engineering the specifications to advantage one company that can supply that good or service. And that enables insider trading and all kinds of things. So higher education institutions can come in here and play a really important role in evaluating the specifications for tenders, because this is highly technical, especially on large infrastructure projects. It's not something that elected and appointed officials can simply do on their own. You need highly skilled civil engineers to evaluate the specifications for water pipes, for bridges, etc. Engineers, electrical engineers for power stations, to make sure that the specifications in terms of procurement are appropriate. So I think there's a resource there that can be used by government as well as NGOs in terms of keeping the specifications clean. Because if you're clever, you rig it from the specifications. The adjudication is a matter of course if you really know how to do corruption. Related to that point is the idea here that people who are good at corruption get their behavior passed through financial scrutiny with a clean bill of health. In other words, they're very good at playing the process in terms of getting their manipulation of processes through rubber stamped, all clear. So we shouldn't make the assumption that just because entities get clean audits that they're corruption free. On the contrary, it could well be that you've got very sophisticated players who know how to use procedure to camouflage the abuse of specifications and adjudication. So higher education institutions can come in here in terms of shedding light on these two things. So expertise in public finance, very important here in terms of shedding light on whether that stamina is actually value for money. Because what the Constitution says, it's got to be a fish, it's got to be value for, it's got to be competitive. And that's where public finance academics can come in and play an important role. So there are a number of technical, almost advisory things that academics at all higher education institutions can do. The technicons are invaluable here because when it comes to building specifications in terms of cement and sand and bricks and steel for windows and lighting and wind movement, in terms of building plans, even that sector of the higher education institution sector has got a crucial role to play. The other second dimension to the answer is that through research, through the dissemination of institution, we can get a much better sense of the extent and the areas where corruption is a hotspot. So through data plotting, we can start to identify the hotspot areas. We can start to identify where the challenges are in supply chain management. We can start to identify who the constituencies who collaborate and collude with officials. We can start to print out broad maps on where the influence peddling is taking place through the gathering of data, the interpretation of data, and analysis of data. And then we can go beyond perception index to real hard data on what's really happening in the corruption space. So let me leave it there.
Thank you, Ivor. Kavisha?
Thanks, Prof. Firstly, I don't think it's not impossible to create a sort of a high trust society in South Africa. And I think that maybe my closeness to the issue and sort of dealing with corruption on a daily basis sometimes does make you feel a bit despondent. But in terms of what's going on in Denmark is that they have a social contract where people have bought into the systems and the laws. I don't know if that's the case here in South Africa. I mean, I don't even think people have bought into constitutional values of non-racialism and non-sexism. At the moment, anti-corruption is becoming not really an issue of morality of right and wrong. The sort of current discourse often relates to it's becoming a racial issue about whose corruption is worse. So I think that we have a long way to go in building this high trust society, and it's something that we have to be committed to. I think we should dismiss it as it can never occur in our own country. But in order to get to that, again, I'm not sure what the exact roadmap is, but corruption is definitely a symptom of the inequality and the injustice that we face in our society. And I think that what we have to do is we have to rectify those issues first. That's how we start to build trust between government and the people. And when the government is sort of looting from the people and taking the resources that were meant to correct all of our inequalities, it creates a massive distrust, and then it becomes difficult for the public to buy into government's plans and buy into the president's commitment because they want to actually see an improvement in their life. Prof, to your second question about corruption in the private sector, I admit that this is something that for a long time people weren't really focusing on, but it's something that Corruption Watch as well as other civil society organizations have recently put a lot more focus and research into. So one of our partner organizations called Open Secrets recently released a very important report about corruption in the private sector called The Enablers. And presently at Corruption Watch, what we are doing is that we are within the next month, we're going to be releasing a report about transparency within the corporate sector, where companies have been scored about their perceived levels of transparency. And from next year, we're undertaking a project on actually taking a deeper dive into the corporate culture and the areas and the loopholes that allow for corruption to manifest there. So it's not enough, but I guess it's a start in terms of actually understanding the scourge within that sector as well.
Thank you very much, Kavisha. We almost 2 minutes before 2. So I think if there's a question from the audience, Kemantha, I will take that, but otherwise I'll conclude. Any questions from the audience? All right, in the absence of questions, let me take this opportunity to thank our panelists today who have given us extremely rich, insightful, sobering, troubling, but also informative inputs about the state of corruption in South Africa. Very well researched presentations, and I would like to thank you all for your contributions today.
Prof. Nose, I'm so sorry. We have a reverend who sent in a document who's now raised his hand. So can I just give him? Yes, can I just allow him to talk?
Okay.
Reverend, you can unmute and you can make your comments. We have less than a minute left.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
For me, it's just to greet the panel, because I'm already late. That's the reason why I sent my submission of what I was going to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. Any other questions, Kemantha? Can we conclude now?
Yes, you may go ahead because we're running short of time.
Right, yeah. So I think that a few things to conclude with. One is that corruption, what we've learned from these discussions, that corruption in our country is endemic, and that it represents a major threat to our democracy. Some would even say to our national security. I think the other issue that came up was that corruption is not victimless, it has consequences. It undermines the rule of law, it erodes social trust, it creates social distress, and it also destroys institutions. And that, you know, we've been talking about corruption. Now we want to see consequences. We want to see action. What is it that's being done about corruption? The government has expressed a commitment to deal with corruption, but South Africans want to see actions. So I would like to thank the Wits School of Governance for providing us with its convening power to host this conversation. And I would like to encourage you to continue to do this. We appreciate the opportunity, and also appreciate the opportunity given to us by the organizers, you know, Lurato, Kemantha, all the administrative work that you've done has been really, really good, and we appreciate that. So this is how we close our webinar this afternoon, and I would like to thank everybody, including the audience, for your time, and you know, for listening to the presentations that were given today. So that is how we close.